Okay, so do you want to continue? No, yes. This is about the connection between insulin resistance and cholesterol metabolism. And now I'm pretty sure this will be, at least some slides will be very molecular. So don't be scared. It's not necessary to write down every detail or understand all the molecules because nobody knows really. This is more speculation when it comes to molecules. But then there are some slides where it's more about what is actually the clinical significance of this, and I think those are more important. So I titled here Partners in Crime because why is this? I mean, both of these have the consequence that they contribute to cardiovascular disease. No doubt about this. So, and they are very common, so very often they seem to coexist. But is that because they have the same cause for both of these, like fatty liver? Or is it just that they are both very common things and that's why they are together? And now this is something where you have to think, I mean, I was telling that cholesterol synthesis is increased in fatty liver. That's one thing. But serum cholesterol is not necessarily increased in fatty liver. Like I showed you, in steatosis it actually is not. So I try to explain this controversy, why cholesterol synthesis is actually a different thing than cholesterol levels in blood. The short answer is because there's the cholesterol balance. If you synthesize more, you absorb less, and the outcome is your levels still remain relatively same, although inside the cell it may be completely different because you have a more cholesterol synthesis, but still at the whole body level it will be balanced out in the lipoproteins. But I try to explain you this controversy. So when we are dealing with cholesterol metabolism, there's basically two parts. There's cholesterol synthesis and there's cholesterol absorption. And this is one of the scariest slides. So this is about cholesterol synthesis. So a lot of molecules. But the point here is, first of all, that insulin, the first connection here is that insulin actually inhibits this pathway in many steps. So if you have insulin, it should do that, but if you have insulin resistance, it doesn't affect. So because there's resistance to insulin effect. So there's one connection between cholesterol synthesis and insulin resistance. Well, the other important message in this slide is that when you have the cholesterol synthesis pathway, it actually makes many other things than cholesterol. Right. Many things we need, like vitamin D and steroid hormones. Many things that actually are important for the cholesterol balance in the cell, because if you just keep producing cholesterol inside the cell, what happens? It will be full of cholesterol, unless there is a way you can break down the system, which is that LDL receptor activity goes down. That is, you take less cholesterol from the blood in liver cells, or there's more cholesterol efflux from the cells. So you need to find a way inside the cells that you don't accumulate too much. And then at the whole body level, the cholesterol will, of course, you have the bile acid system to export the extra cholesterol. So those are more like convinced thing. Everybody would agree that these are important. Then what comes from the side chain of the cholesterol synthesis, I will come back this into the end, because this is something people haven't studied too much, but actually there may be very interesting connections, especially to insulin signaling. And then you can't really talk about cholesterol synthesis or cholesterol metabolism by mentioning that we do have drugs, and that's statins, which are actually very effective drugs to reduce serum cholesterol even, and they work there. That's where they hit. The other part of the equation is that you have cholesterol absorption. And now if you have this, what marks here, this is the gut, this is the enterocyte, the cell there. So how do you get the cholesterol into your gut? Well, there's two ways. Either it's in your diet or it's in bile. And all this gets into your gut. And then you absorb cholesterol first to the enterocytes and then further on. And actually there are a lot of these molecules that are known that regulate the absorption. This is the target of the ezetimibe, the drug I was mentioning in the last slide of the previous talk. So this is where you have a trap preventing cholesterol absorption. These molecules that actually throw the cholesterol back into the gut are pretty much regulated also by insulin. So this is also a regulated process in many levels. And so what can you do? I mean, this is the fact that insulin stimulates LXR, and basically what insulin should do, if you have high insulin, you would reduce cholesterol absorption because you move the cholesterol back in here. Is that logical? I'll come back to this. But it is actually exactly what we see in insulin-resistant people who have high insulin. We do see low absorption. Because if you have a central obesity, you have fatty liver, you have high cholesterol synthesis, but you always have low cholesterol absorption. So partly that's maybe because you actually have a lot of cholesterol here, because you have a lot of cholesterol in bile, and maybe that's what's breaking down your cholesterol absorption. But the other reason could be that these insulin-resistant people, they just have high insulin, and for some reason it works in the gut. And that's why they have low absorption of cholesterol. So what about the plant sterols? Are they efficient in reducing your serum cholesterol, like sitosterol, sitostanol? Do they actually sell them in Spain? In Finland it's pretty common. Well, they have some effect, and that's based on the fact that if you have a lot of plant sterols, they kind of compete with the cholesterol in your gut, and then you absorb less. So this I said already, that if you have type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, your cholesterol absorption is always decreased. Could be because of high insulin, could be because of the balance between synthesis and absorption. In contrast, if you have type 1 diabetes, especially if it's not in a good balance and you are not having enough insulin, so there's an insulin deficiency, then you have high cholesterol absorption, which supports the hypothesis that it's really insulin regulating cholesterol metabolism in the gut. Why are we actually interested in cholesterol? I just remind you that this is the reason why we are interested in cholesterol, because there's a lot of evidence, as you know, that if you measure serum cholesterol or LDL cholesterol, it relates to cardiovascular risk, like the Framingham study or the 7-country study. And so this is why we are discussing cholesterol. This is basically the background why everybody's interested. But why it's elevated in serum? If somebody has an elevated cholesterol that then relates to cardiovascular disease, there's basically two possibilities why it's elevated. One possibility is because there's increased cholesterol synthesis, like there is in the metabolic syndrome. But usually that's connected to low absorption of cholesterol, and in the end, in the metabolic syndrome, the cholesterol may not be changed at all. Maybe it actually is increased in those who have high synthesis, but for some reason their cholesterol absorption is not low, but it's actually normal, and therefore their serum cholesterol is higher than you would expect. So this is always a balance between absorption and synthesis. And now if we talk about personalized medicine, So what would this mean? What do you think? It would mean that in some people it might be more effective to hit the synthesis, and in some people it might be more effective to hit the absorption. And so there are some studies where people have tried to address this question, but currently there's no good ways to predict who would benefit especially for the absorption inhibition and who would benefit more from the synthesis inhibition. And one of the problems is because statins they block cholesterol synthesis. They do that so efficiently that they actually reduce cholesterol so much that none of the other options we have, although they might be theoretically better for one person, they are much less efficient, like ezetimibe, plant sterols, dietary cholesterol reduction. All of this alone is less efficient than statins. So that's why most of the people get the statins anyway, even though it may not be the optimal for them to start with. But at least in those in whom the cholesterol absorption is a significant part of the problem, you should also deal with that arm. Hence, some people use statin in connection with ezetimibe. And all people should use statins in connection with reduced dietary cholesterol and saturated fatty acids. Not just use drugs, because you have nutrition there too. Okay, so this is the cholesterol metabolism part. Then we have the other arm, the insulin resistance. And this is something that the definition sounds very simple, that you have insulin resistance. But is it really clear what we mean by insulin resistance? So traditionally people think that it's impaired action of insulin to reduce blood glucose. So in that definition you kind of reduce insulin resistance to something that only relates to glucose metabolism. But it's not actually the case, because insulin regulates lipoprotein synthesis in the liver. It has an anti-lipolytic effect in adipose tissue. It has some effects in brain, reducing appetite. So if you really have a whole body insulin resistance, it's not only going to be a disturbed glucose metabolism, but it's also other tissues too. On the other hand, you could have a tissue-specific insulin resistance, in which case you would have only the problem which is in that tissue. So this is just discussing the definitions. That think about when you're saying something about insulin resistance, think about what you actually mean. Do you only mean glucose metabolism, or do you also mean other things that are related? Because sometimes it's different. Well, insulin signaling, obviously, as shown here, it does many things, and this is a very, very, very simplified picture about the signal. So we could easily fill the whole slide, and then another slide, and then a third slide. There are so many details there. I'm not trying to go there. So why do we have insulin resistance? Why is this signaling disturbed in whatever tissue? Insulin receptor defects are rare. A couple of them have found in humans. It's very rare. I doubt that many of us will ever see one patient with an insulin receptor defect. But secondary to obesity, it's very common. And the only question there is it's not the question whether it's secondary to obesity, it's more the question, what's the mediating factor? What is the mediating factor that really impairs insulin signaling? And so I'm not going into these molecular discussions, but it could be just the fatty acids in many different ways. It could be inflammatory markers, it could be whatever. But on the other hand, as in the case of fatty liver, the best treatment is to lose weight. And again, it's relatively efficient even if you lose 5 to 10 kilograms. This is a cartoon. So what we'd like to say that how this dyslipidemia is in insulin resistance or the metabolic syndrome. How does it come? First of all, we have obesity. More or less, visceral obesity is more linked to dyslipidemias, and that's because from there you have a direct link to the liver. So the fatty acids go to the liver. So you start producing more VLDL, and triglyceride synthesis goes up. Like I mentioned, cholesterol synthesis goes also up. So you have a lot of VLDL particles filled with triglyceride and glucose, or cholesterol, not glucose. And because liver is insulin resistant, fatty liver is insulin resistant, the insulin that actually is there in high amounts doesn't really do the work. It doesn't impair, it doesn't suppress this VLDL synthesis. It could partly be because it's just because you eat more, you get more fat from your diet. But then your LDL triglycerides will be up, and that what ends up producing small dense LDL that's thought to be more atherogenic than the normal size LDL. But LDL cholesterol is not necessarily up in this process, because now comes the cholesterol balance. If there is a lot of LDL cholesterol, some of that will be taken up by LDL receptor in the liver. Cholesterol absorption goes down. And so the cholesterol balance will even out the effect that if you just have the metabolic syndrome, you don't necessarily have increased LDL cholesterol. Unless, maybe I should say it here already, unless you have another, in most cases maybe an inherited thing that promotes the LDL cholesterol going up. So if you have that, then you will also have increased LDL cholesterol. So this cascade of lipoprotein abnormalities we have in insulin resistance does not necessarily lead to high LDL cholesterol. So if you have this insulin resistance and high serum cholesterol, they usually don't have just one reason. Usually, I would say, and this is simplified, I would say behind insulin resistance in most cases it's obesity. Behind high serum cholesterol in many cases it's that you have it in your family. Not that we would know what exactly is the gene. And this you can easily see. That's one explanation why 1/3 of the obese, at least 1/3 of the morbidly obese patients, they have totally normal LDL cholesterol. And so there has to be something else for the LDL cholesterol. The other example is that if you take any person who has total cholesterol 7 and you put him or her on a diet to lose weight, caloric restriction, and they lose 50 kilograms, that doesn't necessarily affect LDL cholesterol at all. For example, now it's very common to have these low carbohydrate diets. And if you do this diet in a way that, okay, you reduce carbohydrates, which is good, you lose weight. But if you do the thing you shouldn't do, that you increase saturated fatty acids in your diet instead of carbohydrates, you might lose weight, but your cholesterol actually goes up. So that's the reason why I'm not, and I think we should not be favoring this diet, because I mean it's fine if you reduce calories and you lose weight, but don't increase saturated fatty acids, because that's bad for your cholesterol. At least if you have some inherited thing that promotes your cholesterol. So common hypercholesterolemia and insulin resistance are not the same, though they often coexist, but that's because both are very common. So the common hypercholesterolemia, it's common, it's polygenic, it's not one gene, but it's most likely several inherited small things. And you can see that as a high LDL cholesterol. And it could be, some of this could be because of increased absorption, some cases increased synthesis of cholesterol. And the personalized thing was that you might want to try either one of these pathways, whichever is more strong in this person. In the insulin resistance syndrome, it's also very common. It's linked to obesity. There it's high VLDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol could be normal if you don't have any other supporting things in your family. And there you have a high synthesis, but in this case you have a low cholesterol absorption unless there's another reason why it would be high. But of course, now these are the slides that are more generally important even for the clinical work. So what you have to remember that in the insulin resistance syndrome you have many of these other things that actually contribute to cardiovascular risk. It's not only cholesterol. If you would have only the common hypercholesterolemia, which is here, and none of these other things on the right side, that's kind of a more simple thing. Just treating the cholesterol, but because you often have all these other things, then you have a list of things to do. Now to help you out, I tried to convince you in the previous lecture that many of these are actually related to liver fat, and I also told you what could be the most beneficial treatment. So there's a high risk of vascular complications, and now you have to look at the patient, what all things they have, and then start thinking about what is the best way of treating this person. What's the best way of treating cholesterol metabolism, and what's the best way of treating the other things he or she might have. Have you seen this kind of risk estimates? And there's a lot of these. This is just one version. But I think this is important for many reasons. It's even important for the patients to show them that you have this, and therefore you are very much red up here. It's kind of demonstrating to these people that there's a risk. So what do you think? Do people understand the risk? Well, generally maybe not very well. It's just numbers. But at least it shows them that you have these many things. And then also it gives some kind of a possibility to choose for the patient, because if he or she wants to reduce the cardiovascular risk, so you can choose whatever you want to do, because generally people are not willing to change their whole life in a second. It doesn't happen. But this might also help choosing that at least you should do one of these things now and then something else later on. Because when we think about changing lifestyle, it's not going to be one thing, or at one point you can't change everything. So that helps actually with the patient. And then for the doctor or nutritionist or whomever, this is kind of giving the estimate that what would be the most important thing I should target in this person. Where should we really start? Okay, now we stop here. If you have a person has cholesterol 7, weighs 120 kilograms, has slightly elevated fasting glucose, and blood pressure is high. So what do you do? So I'm asking you, what do you do? So that's another question than what the patient should do, but what you are doing there. I think this is a very critical question, really. I mean, if we try to solve this problem we have with cardiovascular diseases, it really is the question, what should we do or what can we do? In the end, it boils down to the question, what can the patient do? Because that's most of these things, other than prescribing drugs, is really something the patient had to do or has to do, him or herself. So, but now there's elevated cholesterol, and there's clearly all these metabolic components of the metabolic syndrome. So I think you should advise and discuss how we could lose weight. That's one thing, obviously. 5 to 10 kilograms might be enough. that may not, or most likely will not, correct the cholesterol if it's 7. So in your dietary advice, you also have to specifically touch the cholesterol issue and saturated fatty acids. And that's already quite a lot. If you think about blood pressure, you may want to discuss salt, for example. And so, but you have to start somewhere. And I generally think, it's the patient in the end has to decide what parts of this, all these different things they might start doing right now. We do have some families where there clearly is even more stronger inherited defect to have high cholesterol. This is not common hypercholesterolemia. This is monogenic hypercholesterolemia, of which the most common is familial hypercholesterolemia. Have you seen this kind of patients? How high is the cholesterol? It could be 10, it could be 15, but sometimes it could be 7. So you really need to ask a little bit about the family, because it's not always clear who has it. But in most cases it will be more than 10. But the message here is that even in these patients in whom the risk of cardiovascular disease is tightly linked to having this monogenic high cholesterol, even in these, the degree of their coronary stenosis is related to how much visceral fat they have. And the visceral fat there is just, it's not because of the LDL receptor defect, it's just that because they have this very common problem many people have everywhere, which is that they are obese. So this is just to say that even if you would have a clear cholesterol defect, even in those patients, it's still important to deal with the metabolic syndrome, because they very often have the metabolic syndrome, because that's very common. Slightly more common thing is something we call familial combined hyperlipidemia. Anybody heard this before? Oh, at least somebody. So this is more like a description of families we see very often, where there are a lot of dyslipidemias in these families, but it's not that they all would have just high cholesterol. Some of them have high triglycerides, some of them have combined hyperlipidemia, which is to have both of these together. And in the beginning, people were thinking that this is a monogenic disease. I don't think it is, and there's no evidence it is. I think it's more like that they have different inherited factors together in these families, and then there are different type of dyslipidemias, but overall high risk. But again, in these families, you can't just concentrate on cholesterol, because clearly also here their insulin sensitivity is different depending on what type of dyslipidemia they have. And so again, whatever patient you have, when you assess cardiovascular risk, you should know why the cholesterol is up, but you can never not think about metabolic syndrome. You always have to think about the other things, because they will be important. Unless it's a lean patient and has nothing else than the cholesterol, but that actually I think it's more rare. I think I have this slide about hyperglycemia, because at least sometimes I get the question that how is type 2 diabetes really linked to this risk, and how, because now I've discussed to you how the dyslipidemias develop in the metabolic syndrome and how we have the common hypercholesterolemia, but then type 2 diabetes is a very common thing. So I think I should show you something about this, how it relates here. And so this is the lipoprotein metabolism, what we have in obese people. And why do they have abnormal glucose metabolism? Is there are several reasons. And this is actually, this should be titled differently. Whether it says glucose metabolism, I think it should actually say insulin resistance. But so this is how we get insulin resistance, because in obesity we have triglyceride storage in other tissues. not sub-Q fat, in liver, in muscle, and then you have less glucose storage and oxidation. That's the insulin resistance of the glucose metabolism. Or you have liver insulin resistance, in which case you have increased gluconeogenesis that also increases the glucose. So the outcome is that you have higher glucose because of this liver and peripheral insulin resistance. So why don't all the obese people have then type 2 diabetes? Anybody has an answer to this? Because this basically happens in all obese people to a certain degree. So why some of them have normal glucose? Like this slide demonstrates that if you have an increasing scale of BMI, yes, if you have a very high BMI, many people have obesity. This is a slide that people always saw. I actually argue that this is not true. I mean, I would say it's up to 50% even if you have a BMI 40. I don't know where they get this 93%. At least in our hands, more than half have normal glucose, even if they are morbidly obese. But I mean, the percentage is not important. The important thing is that not all obese patients have type 2 diabetes. And why is this? You have an answer.
Well, there is a theory,
Yeah.
which is as human, we all have big differences in adaptations and things like that.
Yeah.
And the theory is that every human being has a different threshold for storing fat in their tissues.
Mm-hmm.
So once you pass that threshold is when you start having all these complications.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one explanation and that relates to the fact that if you have a very good capacity to store fat in sub-Q fat, then you are more protected. I mean, women are more protected than men because men tend to store it more here. Just a simple explanation. The other reason why this happens, that not all of them have high, is because of the insulin secretion. Because this, even if you have this, as long as you can produce huge amounts of insulin, okay, you have insulin resistance, but you can still do the work because you have so much insulin. But if together with your insulin resistance that's related to obesity or inflammation, if you have also even a relative defect in insulin secretion, I mean, in type 1 diabetes, you have a total defect of insulin secretion and then you have high glucose, but that's a different story. But in obesity, if you have a relative defect, and people tend to think it's an inherited because it's type 2 diabetes is often also in families. If for inherited reasons you have a relative defect in insulin secretion, then that's enough not to be able to compensate the need for very high insulin. So that's one of the, I guess, at least for me, that's the explanation why not all the patients with obesity get type 2 diabetes, because again, you also need this insulin secretion defect, and that's, in many ways, it's independent of your metabolic syndrome, which is more obesity. But so you can't give one explanation for all the things these people have. You need to have, obesity is one, you need to have one explanation for the high LDL cholesterol, and then for the high glucose you actually probably also need something else. And this is why what explains that not all the obese people are exactly the same. And plus the thing what Pedro is saying, that there's different capacity to tolerate the environment we are now. So people are really individuals. Okay, so hypercholesterolemia and insulin resistance, they often coexist. And high cholesterol is partly explained by insulin resistance. But like I mentioned, you have to look for other reasons. You have to ask, and if it is in the family, in most cases, it's not, you should try and you should always treat with the diet, but don't be disappointed if you can't correct the cholesterol of 7 with the diet. Even if the patients would follow up the diet, it may not be 4. Actually, it never will be 4 with the diet alone, unless they really had a bad diet before. Well, in insulin-resistant subjects, there's a high synthesis of cholesterol, low absorption, and then there are mechanisms how this might happen. And like I said, LDL cholesterol usually is normal unless there are other inherited factors. But even if the LDL cholesterol would be normal, it's not to say it's good, because like I said, the LDL cholesterol particles will be smaller, and that's been related to atherosclerosis, independent of just the LDL cholesterol level. And what I didn't mention, because this was more about cholesterol metabolism in general, but in insulin resistance you have this lipid phenotype, which is obviously high serum triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. And independent of the levels of total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol, this is also a risk for cardiovascular disease. But again, that's something that's related to insulin resistance and can be easily corrected by weight loss. For example, another example again, when I get the patients who go to obesity surgery and they have lipids that are really bad. So what I can promise to these patients is that if you lose this 25% of weight, your triglycerides most likely will go down and your good cholesterol, your HDL cholesterol will go up. But I won't promise anything about total or LDL cholesterol. Because if it changes anything, it's maybe 5%. And in most cases, it's not enough. So you still, even if you have the obesity surgery, but if you have high cholesterol, you probably need statins or other things later on, even if it would be very efficient surgery. And the surgery follows up actually a big dietary change in any case. So. Okay, so I think I'm not going through this because it may only complicate things. And just to mention you, and this is now more like a fun part, don't even read the slide. But there are something that we could, because now that we're saying that insulin regulates partly cholesterol synthesis. Now there are some links that some of these mediators here on the side chain could actually regulate insulin signaling. So we may, by modifying cholesterol metabolism, whether it's diet or drugs or whatever, we might be able to modify signaling, but don't stick to that. The important things were before this. This is just to mention it. Okay, I think I stop here. And I hope to have some questions. I hope this was not too complicated. I know it is, but I hope this helps at least to form some kind of a picture of what this is all about. No questions at all. Well, I'm happy with that, I guess, or not. Okay, so thank you very much for being here. And if you have any questions later on, or if you want to send an email, please, you can find it. It was not on my slides, but you can easily find it in the internet. Okay, thank you.